think stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit.
I remember something that had been lurking in the back of my brain for a very long time.
The black sedan came to a sudden halt at the heavily guarded iron gates of Windsor Great Park. The security guard glanced down at a fresh directive on his digital screen and shook his head, refusing to raise the barrier. Inside the vehicle sat Queen Camilla's sister, entirely unaware that her security clearance had just been permanently revoked. This was not a clerical error. Prince William had personally issued the banishment order, executing a strict, forgotten mandate left behind by the late Queen. The unsigned pass to Windsor. The morning sun had barely cleared the tops of the ancient oak trees in Windsor Great Park. A light frost covered the gravel driveway leading toward the private side entrance of the estate. It was a quiet Thursday morning in August of 2026. The daily routine of the royal household was just beginning. Housekeepers were drawing back the heavy velvet curtains in the main drawing rooms. Polishing staff were already at work in the long corridors. At precisely 7 o'clock, a dark blue vehicle approached the outer security perimeter. The car belonged to Annabel Elliot, the younger sister of Queen Camilla. For years, her vehicle had passed through these exact gates without a single moment of delay. The police officers on duty knew her face well. She was a frequent guest at the palace. She often assisted her sister with private interior design projects across the various royal residences. Her access to the secure zones of the estate had always been taken for granted. The car stopped at the first checkpoint. A veteran security officer stepped out of the stone guardhouse. He did not smile. He did not offer his usual polite greeting. Instead, he held up a flat left hand, signaling for the driver to lower the window. He carried a black clipboard in his right hand. A brand new security manifest was attached to the top of the board. Annabel leaned forward from the passenger seat. She asked the officer if there was a problem with the automated gate transponder. She explained that she had an early appointment with the Queen's wardrobe team inside the private apartments. She needed to review the fabric choices for an upcoming official reception in London. The officer looked down at his list. He stated firmly that her name was no longer on the approved visitor log for the Windsor estate. He explained that a new digital directive had been uploaded to the palace security network at midnight. The system had automatically flagged her vehicle registration number for immediate exclusion. Her long-standing guest pass had been deactivated. Annabel was visibly stunned. She insisted that there must be a clerical mistake. She asked the officer to call the main switchboard at Clarence House to verify her status. She reminded him that she had been visiting these properties for over 2 decades without a single security issue. The officer remained completely unmoved. He replied that the directive did not originate from the Queen's office. It had come directly from the administrative headquarters of the Duchy of Cornwall. The order carried the personal digital signature of Prince William. The instructions were absolute. No exceptions were to be made for extended family members, regardless of their relation to the Queen Consort. The driver of the vehicle looked at Annabel through the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions. The engine idled loudly in the crisp morning air. Behind them, a delivery van carrying fresh produce for the palace kitchens pulled up and waited. The situation was becoming highly visible to the estate staff. Annabel pulled out her mobile phone. She attempted to call her sister's private line. The call went straight to an automated voicemail system. She then tried the number of the Queen's principal private secretary. That call was answered immediately, but the tone on the other end of the line was helpless. The secretary confirmed that Prince William's office had assumed total control over the Windsor estate gate logs as of this week. The officer at the gate stepped back. He pointed toward a small gravel turning circle just outside the main barrier. He requested that the driver turn the vehicle around immediately to avoid blocking the official delivery lane. He stated that any appeals regarding the security status would have to be submitted in writing to the estate management office in Whitehall. The blue car slowly backed away from the iron gates. The tires crunched loudly on the gravel as the driver executed a sharp 3-point turn. Annabel watched the stone guardhouse fade into the distance as they drove back down the long, tree-lined avenue toward the public road. The invisible wall around the royal family had just grown significantly higher. Inside the palace walls, the news of the exclusion spread with incredible speed. By 8 o'clock, the breakfast room at Adelaide Cottage was buzzing with quiet conversations among the senior staff. Prince William sat at his desk, reviewing a series of financial spreadsheets on his laptop. He was completely aware of the incident at the gate. In fact, he had been tracking the digital gate logs on his own device. A senior courtier entered the room without a formal announcement. He looked highly anxious. He informed the prince that Queen Camilla had just been briefed about her sister's removal from the visitor list. The courtier warned that the incident was already causing a massive amount of tension within the main household. He asked if the prince wished to issue a temporary compromise to avoid a public story in the newspapers. William closed his laptop with a firm click. He looked directly at the courtier. He stated that there would be no compromises and no exceptions. He explained that the rules of the estate applied to every single person who did not hold an official royal title. The era of extended family members using royal properties as private clubs was officially over. The prince walked over to the window. He looked out at the vast lawn stretching toward the castle. He reminded the courtier of the strict guidelines regarding family boundaries that had been discussed during the transition period of 2024. The public was demanding a smaller, more transparent monarchy. Funding private access for non-working relatives was a luxury the institution could no longer afford. The confrontation was not just about a parking space or a visitor pass. It was a direct assertion of operational authority. As the Duke of Cornwall, William held the legal rights to manage the lands and properties that supported the heir to the throne. He was using that legal leverage to draw a sharp, indelible line between the core royal family and the social circle surrounding Queen Camilla. The phone on William's desk began to flash with an incoming call from Sandringham. The caller identification showed it was his father's private line. William picked up the receiver, but did not speak first. He waited to hear the tone of the king's voice before deciding how to defend his bold move. The battle lines inside the House of Windsor were being redrawn by the hour, and the future king was showing absolutely no intention of backing down. The archive in the West Tower, Prince William picked up the receiver and held it to his ear. His father's voice was loud. King Charles demanded to know why his sister-in-law had been turned away from the castle gates like a common trespasser. He called the move unnecessary and deeply disrespectful to the Queen. William did not interrupt his father. He waited until the king paused for breath. Then he answered with a single word. He said the word was protocol. He explained that he was simply enforcing the strict guidelines laid out in the private papers of Queen Elizabeth II. The king went silent on the other end of the line. He asked which papers his son was talking about. William told him about a hidden leather box stored in the Round Tower archive. It contained letters from 2022. These letters outlined specific restrictions regarding non-royal relatives staying on crown property. The phone call ended abruptly with a heavy click from the king's end. William hung up his phone. He immediately grabbed his car keys from the desk. He needed to get to the archive before anyone else from the senior staff tried to access those files. 10 minutes later, William walked through the heavy wooden doors of the West Tower Library. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax floor polish. An elderly archivist named Dr. Robert Finch stood by a tall, rolling ladder. He was wearing white cotton gloves to handle the ancient texts. William asked Dr. Finch for the keys to the sovereign's personal correspondence drawer. The archivist looked surprised by the sudden visit. He hesitated for a second before reaching into his tweed jacket pocket. He handed over a small, tarnished brass key. The prince walked to the back of the room where the modern metal filing cabinets stood. These cabinets were protected by a digital keypad and the physical lock. He typed in his authorization code. He inserted the brass key into the top drawer. The drawer slid open with a loud metallic scrape. He searched through the thick folders until he found a blue envelope marked with the late Queen's personal cipher. The letter inside was dated September of 2022, just days before her passing. It was addressed directly to the keeper of the privy purse. The document was highly specific. The late Queen wrote that the extended family members of any future Queen consort must not be granted permanent security clearances. She noted that allowing non-working relatives to use royal facilities created a false impression of official status. She wanted a clear distinction maintained between blood royals and marital relatives. William took a digital photograph of the page using his encrypted smartphone. This was his legal shield. He knew that if he kept this document hidden, the king would simply overrule him using his royal prerogative. But with this paper, William had the backing of the family's most respected modern leader. Dr. Finch watched from a distance. He asked if the prince needed the physical copy removed from the room. William told him to leave it exactly where it was. He wanted the original paper to remain in the official archives so no one could accuse him of tampering with the historical record. As William walked out of the tower, his phone buzzed again with a text message from his brother-in-law's office in London. The media was starting to ask questions about the security changes at Windsor. A reporter from the Daily Mail had spotted Annabelle's car turning around on the public highway. The prince did not reply to the text. He walked down the stone steps toward his parked vehicle. He knew the next move would come from Camilla herself. She was not the type of person to let her family be publicly embarrassed without a fight. He drove back toward his private office at Kensington Palace. The drive took 40 minutes through the morning traffic. When he arrived, his personal secretary met him at the door. She reported that Queen Camilla had just booked an unscheduled helicopter flight from her residence in Scotland. She was heading straight to Windsor Castle to meet with the king. William walked into his briefing room. He told his secretary to schedule an immediate meeting with the head of the Metropolitan Police Royalty Protection Command. He needed to ensure the police officers at the gates understood that his orders trumped any verbal permissions given by the king's personal staff. The secretary nodded and began typing on her keyboard. The operational machinery of the palace was now caught between two opposing forces. The king wanted to protect his wife's family comfort, but the future monarch was determined to strip away their unearned privileges before the new year arrived. William sat at his desk and pulled up the digital map of the Windsor estate on his monitor. He looked at the various red dots representing active security badges. He clicked on 3 specific names associated with Camilla's inner circle. With 3 quick strokes of his mouse, he suspended their access privileges until further notice. The screen flashed green to confirm the changes. The digital locks on the side gates were now updated. The extended family was officially locked out of the inner courtyard. But William knew that digital locks were easy to change. The real challenge would be the face-to-face confrontation that was brewing for the afternoon. The protocol of exclusion. The digital screen in the Kensington Palace briefing room flickered to life at precisely 10 minutes past 2. The face of Sir Edward Young, a senior advisor who had transitioned to an elder statesman role within the king's private office, appeared on the secure video link from Buckingham Palace. His expression was tight. He sat at a mahogany table surrounded by printed spreadsheets and security reports. He did not waste time with formal greetings. He immediately brought up the incident at the Windsor gates, calling it an unprecedented operational failure that had embarrassed a senior member of the Queen's immediate family. Prince William adjusted his position in his chair. He did not look at the papers on his own desk. He looked directly into the camera lens. He stated that the incident was not a failure of security, but a success. The police officers on duty had followed the digital protocol perfectly. He explained that any individual without an official royal warrant or a pre-cleared diplomatic invitation was subject to the exact same screening and refusal procedures, regardless of their family connections. Sir Edward leaned forward, his image shifting slightly on the screen. He argued that the Queen Consort possessed the traditional right to grant verbal clearance to her personal guests within her husband's private residences. He stated that by overriding those verbal permissions, William's office had created a dangerous conflict of authority that was causing massive confusion among the rank-and-file officers of the Metropolitan Police. The staff did not know whose orders to follow when the King's household said yes and the Duke of Cornwall's office said no. William tapped his fingers flat against the table. He told Sir Edward that the confusion would end the moment everyone accepted the legal reality of the property deeds. He reminded the advisor that under the Crown Estate Act updates and the private family agreements finalized in 2024, the physical management of the Windsor perimeter fell under the direct control of the heir to the throne. The king retained ownership of the sovereign titles, but the daily operational budgets and gate access protocols were managed by the duchy offices. To settle the point, William signaled his secretary to share the digital image of the late Queen's 2022 Balmoral Directive on the screen. The text appeared alongside the current video feed. The sharp, elegant signature of Queen Elizabeth II was visible at the bottom of the parchment. William pointed out the specific clause that barred non-royal relatives from holding the permanent, unmonitored gate transponders. He stated that he was simply cleaning up an accumulation of administrative errors that had allowed those rules to slide over the past 2 years. Sir Edward stared at the document on his monitor for a long moment. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. He admitted that the legal text was genuine, but he argued that enforcing it so rigidly during a time of heightened family stress was a political mistake. He warned that the media would interpret this as a bitter feud between Kensington Palace and the king's inner circle. The tabloids would paint William as an unfeeling manager trying to isolate his father from his wife's family support network. William rejected the argument immediately. He stated that public relations strategies could not be built on a foundation of administrative slop. If the public discovered that taxpayers were funding 24-hour police checkpoints that allowed private interior designers and extended family members to bypass standard security screening, the backlash would be far worse than a few negative headlines about family tension. He insisted that transparency required a hard line between public duty and private privilege. The video conference was interrupted by a chime on William's secure mobile device. A text message from the security control room at Windsor Castle indicated that Queen Camilla's helicopter had just touched down on the private landing pad near the golf course. The Queen had skipped her scheduled rest period in Scotland to fly directly into the center of the dispute. She was accompanied by her principal private secretary and 2 personal protection officers. William looked back at the camera and told Sir Edward that the conversation was now concluded. He stated that his office would issue a formal administrative memorandum to the Metropolitan Police Command by 5 o'clock that afternoon. The memorandum would explicitly define the new boundaries for non-royal visitor access. There would be no room for verbal overrides from any courtier, no matter how senior. He ended the video link with a single tap on his keyboard, freezing the screen back into darkness. The prince stood up and walked over to the large whiteboard on the wall of his briefing room. He grabbed a black marker and drew a line dividing the family into 2 distinct columns. On one side, he listed the working royals who held official constitutional roles. On the other side, he listed the extended family members who held no public responsibilities but frequently appeared at royal properties. He told his chief of staff that every single person in the second column would have their gate privileges audited before the winter season arrived. The chief of staff looked concerned. She asked what would happen if King Charles issued a direct, written sovereign decree to reinstate Annabel Elliott's access badge. She pointed out that while William managed the estate logistics, the king still held ultimate constitutional authority over the royal household's funding allocations. A direct clash of written decrees would force the government's legal advisors in Whitehall to step in and mediate a private family dispute. William capped the marker with a loud snap. He stated that he welcomed that discussion. If the king wanted to go to the prime minister to argue that his sister-in-law deserved special security exemptions at Windsor, he could do so. But William knew his father would never risk that kind of political embarrassment. The king understood the fragile state of public support for the monarchy in 2026 and would not jeopardize the institution over a gate pass. The prince then ordered his security team to monitor the digital logs for the remainder of the afternoon. He wanted to see if anyone at Windsor attempted to manually bypass the system to let Camilla's sister back in through a side gate. He knew that the old network of loyalties ran deep among the older palace staff, and some veteran porters might try to do a favor for the Queen's family out of old habits. By 3 o'clock, the digital monitor on William's desk showed that a security badge assigned to a senior housekeeper at Windsor had been used to access the private archives near the deanery. Someone was trying to look up the historical precedents for family guest access. William smiled coldly at the screen. He knew they would find nothing that could counter the late Queen's explicit written instructions. The protocol of exclusion was absolute, and the future king had successfully locked the gates against the old court. A house divided by ink. The helicopter rotor blades slowly stopped spinning on the private grass landing pad at Windsor Castle. Queen Camilla stepped out onto the lawn, her face set in a hard, determined expression. She did not wait for the small luggage vehicle to approach. She walked briskly across the grass toward the private side entrance of the royal apartments. Her private secretary struggled to keep pace behind her, clutching a red leather folder packed with official correspondence. The Queen went straight to the king's private sitting room. King Charles was seated by the large bay window, looking out over the manicured lawns. A silver teapot and 2 untouched cups sat on a tray between the chairs. The room was warm, but the atmosphere inside was completely frozen. Camilla did not sit down. She walked over to the desk and dropped a copy of the security notification onto the blotter. She stated that the situation was entirely unacceptable. Her sister had been treated like an unwanted intruder at the gates of a home where she had worked for years. She told the king that this was not just a simple administrative error by a junior clerk. It was a calculated public insult directed at her entire family by Prince William. She demanded that the king immediately reverse the digital order and restore her sister's security credentials before the evening news cycle began. The king looked down at the paper on his desk. He looked tired, his shoulders slightly hunched under his tweed jacket. He explained softly that he had already spoken to William on the secure line from London. He told his wife that the legal situation regarding the estate boundaries was far more complicated than they had initially realized. William was not acting on a personal whim. He was enforcing a specific written mandate that had been signed by Queen Elizabeth II during her final days at Balmoral. Camilla's expression shifted from anger to deep disbelief. She asked why a document from 2022 was suddenly being used to lock her family out of the castle in 2026. She argued that the late queen had always been gracious to her guests and understood the need for family support behind the palace walls. She insisted that William was using the old papers as a convenient excuse to isolate her and diminish her influence within the household. The king picked up his reading glasses. He explained that William, in his legal role as the manager of the Duchy of Cornwall and the administrator of the Windsor estate, held the absolute right to enforce those old regulations. The financial agreement signed during the transition of 2024 had explicitly transferred the operational budgets and gate protocols to the heir to the throne. The king admitted that he could not simply issue a verbal override to change the security system without creating a massive legal conflict between their two offices. Camilla walked over to the window, turning her back to her husband. She looked out at the distant iron gates where her sister had been turned away just hours earlier. She stated that if the king could not control his own gates, then the power balance within the family had shifted too far. She warned that allowing William to dictate who could visit the private apartments made the reigning monarch look like a prisoner in his own palace. She asked how they were supposed to maintain the dignity of the court if the future king could change the locks whenever he pleased. The king did not answer immediately. He poured a cup of tea, his hand shaking slightly as he lifted the silver pot. He knew that his wife was right about the public perception, but he also understood the cold reality of their financial situation. The government in Whitehall was constantly reviewing the costs of royal security. If the Prime Minister discovered that non-royal relatives were using tax-funded police checkpoints for private business, the political fallout would be devastating for the entire family. Meanwhile, back at Kensington Palace, William was receiving real-time updates on the meeting from a senior courtier inside Windsor. He sat at his large mahogany desk, watching the digital status of the castle's network on his screen. He knew that his stepmother would push his father to make a stand, but he also knew that his father's legal team had already reviewed the property deeds and concluded that William's position was completely airtight. The prince called his chief of staff into the room. He instructed her to prepare a formal briefing document for the press office. The text would state that the updates to the Windsor Security Manifest were part of a routine, long-planned efficiency review aimed at reducing the burden on local police resources. It would explicitly state that the new guidelines applied strictly to all individuals who did not hold an official constitutional title. It was a clean, professional explanation that left no room for stories about a bitter family feud. The chief of staff asked if they should expect a formal complaint from the Queen's lawyers. William shook his head confidently. He stated that Camilla's advisors were too clever to launch a legal battle they were guaranteed to lose. They would realize that pushing the issue would only force Kensington Palace to make the late Queen's letter public, which would cause even more embarrassment for her family and the press. Back at Windsor, the discussion between the King and Queen had reached a quiet, bitter conclusion. Camilla turned away from the window and looked at her husband. She stated that she would not allow her family to be humiliated again by trying to enter the gates under these conditions. She announced that she was canceling her sister's upcoming design consultations at the castle entirely. Her family would stay away from the royal estates, not because they were locked out, but because they refused to participate in William's game. The king stood up and walked over to his wife. He placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a quiet apology for the way the situation had been handled. He promised that he would speak to William again about finding a more discreet way to manage family visits in the future. But they both knew that the promise was an empty gesture. The ink on the legal documents was dry, and the future king had already proven that he possessed the power to enforce his own terms. As the afternoon light faded over the castle towers, the security teams completed their shift change. The new officers at the gates were briefed on the updated digital manifest. The name of Annabelle Elliot remained completely blacked out on the screen. The unseen wall around the core royal family had been successfully established, and the dynamic inside the House of Windsor had been permanently altered by a single stroke of a pen. The Iron Decree. The final administrative memorandum from Kensington Palace was officially logged into the Royal Security Database at exactly 5 o'clock that evening. The document was titled the Windsor Perimeter Directive. It was written in short, precise paragraphs that left absolutely no room for misunderstanding. It stated that from this day forward, all private guest passes for Crown properties must be reviewed and approved by the estate's managing trustee every 90 days. The verbal permissions of previous years were permanently obsolete. The immediate result of the decree was felt across every royal residence in England. In London, security teams at Clarence House began checking the identification badges of all incoming visitors with a new level of strictness. In Scotland, the gate logs at Balmoral Castle were updated to match the new Windsor standard. The loose, informal network of friends and extended relatives that had surrounded the court for decades was methodically dismantled in a matter of hours. The media response followed quickly, just as Prince William had anticipated. The evening news broadcasts carried a short statement from the palace press office. The statement explained that the security updates were part of a routine modernization plan to reduce the burden on the Metropolitan Police budget. There was no mention of the confrontation at the gate. There was no mention of Annabelle Elliot's vehicle being turned away. The palace had successfully framed a major family shift as a simple matter of public efficiency. Behind the closed doors of Windsor Castle, the atmosphere remained incredibly tense. Queen Camilla did not attend the scheduled dinner with the king that evening. Instead, she remained in her private sitting room, surrounded by her closest personal aides. She knew that she had lost this round of the power struggle. William had not just locked her sister out of the gate. He had demonstrated to the entire household that the true operational power within the monarchy had already passed to the next generation. King Charles spent the evening in his study, reviewing the financial reports for the upcoming year. He did not attempt to contact his son again. He understood the logic behind William's cold, institutional strategy. The monarchy was entering a highly vulnerable period, and the future king was doing exactly what was necessary to protect the core institution from public criticism. The personal cost to the family was high, but the survival of the crown was the only metric that truly mattered. As night fell over the great park, the heavy iron gates stood locked against the dark road. The police officers on duty sat in the stone guardhouse, watching the digital screens update with the fresh visitor manifests for the weekend ahead. The names of the old court were gone, replaced by a lean, restricted list of working officials. The future king had drawn his line in the gravel, and the House of Windsor had no choice but to follow his lead. The bold move by Prince William at the Windsor gates sends a clear message about how he intends to run the monarchy when his time comes. By enforcing the strict, forgotten guidelines of the late Queen, he has drawn a hard boundary between public duty and private family privilege, shifting the balance of power inside the palace forever.